Thank you so much, both. So what we are going to do today in next 1.5 hours, CPR President Yamini is busy with some administrative responsibilities. She will join us soon. So first 15 minutes, I would request Professor Bardhan to give us a summary of, not just a summary of the book, but what provoked him to write this book and what is happening in the world, that he's titling this book as World of Insecurity, and what are the disenchantments that is going through both rich and poor countries. After that, Professor Mehta and Professor Bardhan will be in a conversation for 15 to 20 minutes. And then we'll open it up for Q&A. So before that, why don't we, just raise the book and a toast to this book. Thank you, sir. So you have to switch this on.
Thank you, Rahul, for those generous remarks. And thank you all for coming to listen to us. The book is one of the products of COVID, when I usually travel a lot, and those 2 years I have been mostly confined to home. In this period, I wrote 2 books. One is this, meant for 2 books, both for general readers. This book was entirely for a general reader. In fact, this book does not have even a footnote, not to speak of no charts, no equations, and no footnotes. And the other book I wrote, I finished recently, is Rahul referred to my Bengali memoir, which was in 2014. I just finished a memoir in English, quite different. Particularly because the readers are different. And that is going to come out, HarperCollins India is going to bring it out latter part of next year. What induced me to write this book is, of course, well known, if echoing part of the beginning sentence of a famous book in the 19th century, a specter is haunting the whole world today. And that is that of right-wing extremism, not just in the rich countries, the United States, Britain, Europe, but also developing countries. And in fact, the book has quite a bit on particularly 3 developing countries. One is India, of course, and then Turkey and Brazil under Bolsonaro. And Europe, of course, is both Western and Eastern Europe. There's been a lot of rise of right-wing extremism. Even in France, one has to remember that the extreme right party of Marine Le Pen got about 42% of the vote in the last presidential election. And after the book was published, 2 countries have now leading parties which have roots in fascism. One is Italy, where the party explicitly has some roots in the fascist Italian fascism, and in Sweden, of all countries, recently the main backer of the current ruling government is a party which has roots in neo-Nazism. The only possible exception, you might say, some Latin American countries, Colombia, Chile, Peru, and most recently the election in Brazil, in which Lula won. But even though Lula won, Bolsonaro got about 49.2% of the vote. So, and even in the other countries I mentioned in Latin America, Colombia, Chile, etc., the right-wing parties dominate in the legislature. So it's a worldwide phenomenon. Often I find in the analysis, there's a great deal of analysis going all through in the last 2, 3, 4 years. There have been quite a few books that come out. One distinctive feature of my book is, I'll say 3 or 4. One is, of course, unlike the other books, which are mostly on US and Europe, my book covers both rich and poor countries. The other is that certainly among economists, but not just economists, there is a tendency to explain this phenomenon in terms of rising inequality. Of course, in many parts of the world, inequality has been rising, and inequalities, even in parts of the world where inequality is not rising, is quite often, the level is quite high. I think rising inequality is very important issue to discuss, but I personally don't think, and that in the beginning part of the book, I go over it, it's not inequality per se. Otherwise, you don't expect this. One question that in the first part of the book discusses is, why are the working classes turning right rather than left? Inequality is a left-wing, traditional left-wing issue. Why are they turning? If they're really so exercised by inequality, why are they turning right? Quite often rallying under the banner of billionaires. Trump is a billionaire. Viktor Orban is a billionaire. Putin is a billionaire. Marine Le Pen in France is a billionaire. Erdogan is a billionaire. Brexit in England, one of the original leaders was Nigel Farage. He's, if not a billionaire, his assets hundreds of millions of dollars. Erdogan among developing countries, Erdogan, as I said already, is a billionaire. In India, Mr. Modi is not a billionaire, but he's quite cozy with billionaires. So I don't think it's this aversion to inequality that is agitating the poor people or the working classes as such. I personally think that workers are much more worried about insecurity. That's why the book is on insecurity. So if you are a poor worker, I don't think you have even an idea what happens to the top 1%, how much they go. They have no idea about the top, but they know their life is insecure, and they are agitated about that. But by the way, in the book is not just about economic insecurity, is not just economic insecurity. It's economic, and I'm calling it cultural insecurity, but it's an overall term. You have all kinds of non-economic insecurity. And much of the book is on this cultural insecurity. And this cultural insecurity could be in terms of insecurity, say in Europe or the United States, about the assault on, quote unquote, assault on their culture from immigrants. Immigration is both an economic and cultural issue, but in Europe, where a reasonable welfare state, in much of Western Europe, the insecurity is cultural. What it means to have immigrants from a completely different culture. Quite often, the people point out that these movements, right-wing movements, share with the left and their attitude to the elite, they're anti-elite. But I think people forget to mention that they're actually reacting to different kinds of elite. The left usually reacts to economic elite, financial elite. But these right-wing leaders, they're rallying people, they're rousing people against the cultural elite or the liberal elite. So you hear about the Khan market gang. It's not about the financial elite. It's the Khan market gang is about the cultural liberal elite. The same in Bolsonaro or Trump or Viktor Orban. They're talking again about the liberal cultural elite. And then I discuss about there's certain structural changes as the knowledge economy advances. When there's the gulf between the blue-collar workers and the white-collar workers, or the professional workers, are expanding, and that is causing quite a bit of quite a bit of disaffection. So the first part of the book is about trying to understand that, and then I go on to issues that have been raised in this. One, of course, important issue is, in fact, this is a slogan, back to the community. And there's a whole chapter on the community, and there I'm ambiguous. There are many things a community can do, central organizations cannot do, or governments cannot do, but there are also problems with the community. If you have problems with the Khap Panchayat, you know what communities can do sometimes. In the US South, when they oppress the white supremacists, oppress the blacks, who do they turn to? They turn to the center, the federal government, for rescue, because the local governments don't address those issues. Then the community, from, if you think of the political community, then there's a whole chapter on nationalism, and there I talk about different kinds of nationalism, both the ethnic nationalism, which is the more prominent one, but I also talk about other kinds of nationalism. Just as I think we should not allow, or should at least try to disallow, we should try to disallow Hindutva people to take up that they are the only representative of Hindus. There are other kinds of Hinduism that one should think about. That is not the only kind of Hinduism. Similarly, the ethnic nationalism is not the only kind of nationalism. I discussed quite a bit on civic nationalism. Now, it's not just a theoretical concept. I would say in two countries, civic nationalism has been practiced for quite some time. United States is one of the earliest example where nationalism is based on constitutional values with lots of lapses, no doubt. But constitutional, Habermas has a concept of constitutional patriotism. The German philosopher, he was of course reacting to the German ethnic nationalism on the basis of blood, and etc. And there's also a lot of fragility to civic nationalism. I do discuss it, but I discuss in the Western theories of nationalism, the kind of nationalism based on society and social values of tolerance that both Gandhi and Tagore very much advocated. I discussed that. Then I discussed China. There's a whole chapter on China. Why authoritarian capitalism of the Chinese type is not an alternative model, and there's a whole chapter on this. There are some good things about Chinese governance, and I say some of these good for this, some of these good things, authoritarianism is neither necessary nor sufficient. Then the rest of the book is mostly on policies, and those policies I give an aggregative term of social democracy. Even though social democratic parties have been discredited, I think there is a scope for rejuvenating some of the social democratic values. And in terms of policy, I particularly emphasize improving the voice of workers in corporate governance, and this is certainly in rich countries where workers do not have much of a voice. I give the example of Germany, where workers do have an important voice. Works councils in Germany now a very important part. In German, most large German companies, in the board of supervisors who hold the major power, half of that board is by workers, and that has also given more voice to women workers in Germany. But other than that, in say United States, workers do not have much of a voice. This was an issue, by the way, in American presidential election with the campaign of Elizabeth Warren, and she emphasized the issue of workers' voice. The workers' voice is also important to me for a very important economic reason, and that is not just for worker empowerment, but the way innovation, robotization, and automation and artificial intelligence, that kind of innovation is going, is often job displacing, labor displacing. And there is a movement among some economists now is to redirect an innovation to, that is not the only type of innovation, even though practically, commercially, that's what happens. But if workers have some voice in the corporate governance, they may redirect research and development in directions where more jobs are created, labor absorbing rather than labor replacing. I do discuss that quite a bit in the book, in different parts of the book. And then in terms of other policies, there's a whole one chapter on universal basic income. Now, unlike in India and some other places, developing countries, when universal basic income is discussed at all, if at all, it's discussed as an anti-poverty measure. I don't look at it as an anti-poverty measure. I look at it as part of basic minimum economic right to minimum economic security, which is very important to emphasize the right to economic security, because in this country now, we are having, even when some things are done for the poor, they come as a gift from the Prime Minister, sometimes with his picture. But that is completely the wrong approach, because that is like subjects getting things from the king. I think the universal basic income belongs to a whole set of agenda for ensuring the minimum economic right of citizens, not subjects. And then I do a very back of the envelope type arithmetic calculation why, even though universal basic income is quite expensive to do in rich countries, particularly with their current welfare state budget, unless you replace something. In India, even without replacing some of the existing welfare policies, it is possible if you rearrange, for example, restructure these our subsidies, huge subsidies that we have. It's not politically easy to do, but it is possible to have a reasonably decent universal basic income for everybody, for Ambani as well as for the poor. And that is because I look at it not as an anti-poverty, but as a minimum right issue, minimum economic right issues. Just as Ambanis have right to police protection, even though they can hire many protectors, but they have the basic right. Similarly, I think it's an economic right. And the rest of the last chapter is on other kinds of economic policies, where I discuss jobs, which of course is the most important problem, not just in India, in many developing countries, and also, by the way, China, with all this phenomenal growth, is facing a tremendous youth unemployment problem right now. So jobs, and particularly green jobs, I discussed. Then I discuss policies of anti-monopoly policies to reduce corporate concentration, increase labor bargaining power. And one important source of increasing labor bargaining power is to have, and this is part of, there's a whole section on policies of international coordination. And I think their restriction on international capital mobility, to me, is very important, particularly if you look at it from the point of view of labor bargaining power. And just as I mentioned, anti-monopoly power, anti-monopoly, antitrust legislation is important not just for itself, but to save labor bargaining power is important. I also discuss issues like coordination on tax policies, corporate tax policies, vaccination policies, and so on in the book. And last thing that I want to mention is that I look upon trade unions not just as and there is quite a few sections on trade unions in the book. I look upon it, trade unions, not just an organization to bargain and raise wages. I also look upon trade unions as a cultural organization, in the sense, trade unions in some countries, particularly European countries and some Latin American countries, used to have a role in transcending the nativist passions, taming and transcending some nativist passions. What has happened with the decline of trade unions in many countries, trade unions was also a source of pride in your own work, anchor for pride in your own work. And so with the decline of trade unions, there's a cultural void. And that's where, nationalism, religious fundamentalism has filled in that void. And there is a need to reorient there. And I discuss it. Now, these things are all easy to say, but of course, difficult, very difficult to do. But that's our only hope. Otherwise, we have to be completely despondent. The book ends in some kind of what I call upbeat skepticism. I'm skeptical whether these things can be done, but what else can we say now instead of giving up completely? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Bardhan. Before I bring in Pratap, let me ask a question. It's basically something which I needed a little bit more clarity. Of course, as you rightly mentioned, this book is written in the same format as your classic, The Political Economy of Development, without a lot of footnotes and very lucid in style. And perhaps that's why John Romer in his praise says that this is one of the books where ratio of ideas to pages is very, very high. So the question is this, you're saying that a lot of scholars working on this question have primarily focused from the angle of economic inequality and not focused on socio-cultural anxieties or insecurities that has developed into the system, which is giving rise to anti-democratic forces to rise. Now, inequality is an empirical phenomena. One can observe when it's going down and up. How do we measure insecurity? Has it only gone up post-war period, say from 1945 and onwards? And what we are looking today is basically high levels of inequality and high levels of insecurity. And that's why this kind of mobilization is possible. Or insecurities have always remained there. And now you have got some charismatic mobilizers with instruments like political parties to be able to draw upon these latent prejudices and anxieties and carry out the assault that you have been talking about. So that would be a sort of one question. The second one, what I like.
I'll forget. Can I respond to that?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Yes. A measurement, of course, of cultural insecurity is extremely difficult and probably impossible. But there are pointers. Some measurement issues are perception issues in which people have an inflated idea. So, for example, there are many surveys now which show in Europe, the workers are very much worried about immigration. So when they're asked, what do you think is the proportion of immigrants in our population? They usually say, 25 to 30%, even in countries where it's in single digit. The real figure is single digit. But the real figure of single digit is generating cultural insecurity of a much more inflated. And part of the right-wing technique of mobilization is to create a sense of victimhood. And we are all familiar with that in India, create a sense of being outnumbered, even though, Muslims are in India is a very small percentage. The 200 million out of 1,400 million, the percentage is quite small. They're going to take over. This is not India. France, a country like France, there is right-wing intellectuals are coming up with theories of what they call the great replacement theory. There is a novelist, Michel Houellebecq. He has a book, a 2017 book called Submission. And in that book, the whole book is a dystopian prospect of one day France becoming an Islamic republic. And that's about that dystopian. So measurement, because it's perception, even though immigrant population may be only, say, 5%, that measurement is not good enough because the cultural perception. So that it's much more difficult, I think. But I think one can generate information on these issues. And similarly, for example, immigrants are taking all jobs. And on the issue of latency that you mentioned, that certainly is true. We all know about issues like the communal tension, which has always been there in India, how some people stoke it, some people try to transcend it. But let me give you an example, which I give it in the book, from a completely different part of the world, Austria. In the recent election in Austria, the right wing one of the placards was about, in the 16th century, Ottoman pillaging around Vienna. That was an issue. And then in the analysis of the votes, I saw that because of the right wing stoking of this latent thing, in the pillaged areas, historically pillaged areas, 16th century, historically pillaged areas voted more for the right wing than the historically non-pillaged area. Even though everybody says just a few decades back, there's no difference, just because it's been stoked. So yes, latency becomes a very important, but in general, measurement is a tough issue, but measurement is a tough issue in economic inequality, but it's certainly very tough. Yeah.
So the second is not a question, but more of a sort of a comment to both you and Pratap to consider this point, which is all the works that are now coming on democracy decline basically do cite how democracies die. And the big picture argument from that book is that unlike what used to happen in 70s and 80s, where it was military-style coups, now in the 21st century, basically elected politicians are using instruments of democracy to kill democracy slowly. But if you look at public opinion polls, and even that coming out from India, so I don't want to get into the electoral support or electoral legitimacy, but if you ask people directly, do you think democracy in India has declined, has increased, or has remained the same, nothing has changed? A large proportion or majority of people basically say democracy, in fact, in last 10 years have increased. And this is not in one poll, but different polls with different samples. So should the question of democracy at the heart ignore what demos are thinking, what people are thinking, and largely continue to look questions of democracy from scholarly perspective, especially that have been theorized in the post-war period when everywhere democracy was on rise? Should there be a separate way of looking at what democracy means when democracies are actually on decline across the globe? So that's not a question, but just for you both to begin your conversation. And
you want to start, then I can.
Yeah. So it's a real privilege to read this book, and Professor Bardhan has been our teacher, and I think his claim to writing one of the few classics in the field of political development that will endure. It is, as you'd expect, a very wide-ranging book, and I think its signal virtue is that it treats the rise of right-wing governments, populism across the world, and tries to come up with something of a unified framework to thinking about it. And certainly, I think at this historical moment, the fact that almost all of this happens simultaneously across the world, as by the way, previous regime transmissions happens in the 1970s backslide to authoritarianism, the 1950s instantiation of democracy, does mean that you have to actually take a global frame. And any analysis that starts purely in a domestic context is probably missing the big picture. It also has the signal virtue of actually treating the crisis of authoritarian legitimation in China and democratic legitimation simultaneously. So we are deeply grateful. I must confess, and just to provoke the conversation, and this is perhaps sharing my own ignorance in the subject, I am less and less convinced that we have even a minimal handle in terms of trying to understand what the drivers of politics are at this moment. Okay? So I'm very sympathetic to pretty much every aspect of Professor Bardhan's argument. there's economic insecurity, the rise of majoritarian nationalism, his vision for social democracy. Actually, you know, at one level, I think that's a very both diagnostically quite convincing and prescriptively quite an appealing prognosis. But the more I read the book, the more I felt, how do we know whether any of this, it's in the spirit of Rahul's question, is actually the case? So let me just lay out 3 or 4 propositions on the big arguments of the book. So first is the argument about economic insecurity. And at one level, that's got to be true, right? I mean, that there is something about, and I think Professor Bardhan's brilliance in choosing the word insecurity, because in some senses, it captures an amalgam of actual structural conditions and psychological responses to it, which is, I think, you know, really actually helpful thinking about it. And he broadens it out to think of social and cultural insecurity. But what do we know about, right, at least as far as one can tell from the empirical data in different countries, about how much does economic insecurity matter? Now, one of the challenges in thinking about this, I mean, this is just a sort of pedantic point when we make causal claims of any kind, right, is the difference between the significance of outcomes that we see. Lots of political scientists have made this point, and the significance of the explanation that we use, right? So the example that is normally cited is, let's say, Brexit, right? Wins by what, 51.9, something like 52, 53% of the vote, 4% margin difference between, right? Now, the outcome is huge, right? And you could actually say that the significance of that outcome, that 4%, is explained by economic insecurity. But the explanatory question is not the variation in the 4%. The explanatory question is, how do you get to this 48, 50% in the first place, right? Or similarly with the rise of BJP. And it just prima facie strikes me as very hard to believe that actually there is such a sea change in insecurity, that the significance of the explanation in building up that core actually lies in that. And it's not proven by any, in a sense, any of the data. I mean, in fact, you know, yes, the 2009 financial crisis was quite a pivotal moment in this kind of global story. But compared to what benchmarks of economic insecurity? Unemployment rates in the 70s, 80s were higher. It actually led to a turn, not to actually repression of democracy post-80s. It led to a neoliberal turn in economics, but actually a strengthening of democratic institutions, sort of, right? In the United States, it's very puzzling how intransigent the vote seems to be to variation in economic policy. I mean, Biden is trying to run the, you know, every sort of, I mean, he's now reneged on the Amtrak agreement, but in a sense, the vision was social democratic. Barely any movement in vote share. Poland, right, the country that does magnificently out of integration into EU, and Spain, which is the highest unemployment rate, completely different trajectories, right? Sweden, the social democratic model, right, Nordics model, rightward turn. So I actually do think that there is, we just don't know enough to be able to specify either measuring the form of insecurity or actually the political mechanism by which it expresses itself. I think it's a good, in a sense, intuition to pursue, but once you start disaggregating these different pictures, right? I mean, let's not forget, very last election in the United States, the Democrats have lost California and New York, right? And we can ask why that is the case. I mean, I have a simpler explanation for it, which I'll come to. So I do think the question of economic insecurity needs a lot more empirical and psychological specification. Insecurity in relation to what? When crime rates were actually high in the United States, and crime was actually a big electoral issue, or often articulated in racial terms, right? Why was that a less insecure environment than that neoliberal moment when actually the one thing about those 20 years was crime rates went down precipitously, right? So I think the first is just on this question of insecurity, in a sense, what's going on here. Now, one way in which, at least in the Western world, the insecurity argument has been articulated is, and this might add to Professor Bardhan's argument in some ways, is to say that, look, you can't pinpoint it to that level of specificity. Did the Democrats lose Wisconsin or Michigan because of the China trade effect, which changed 3% of the votes? There'll be a lot of empirical, dispute about that. What you do begin to see, however, right, is actually very large structural shifts that over time, there's a sense in society that we've reached the exhaustion of a particular way of doing things. So think of the 70s as that moment. Oil shocks happen, there's an economic crisis, and then there's a kind of sort of neoliberal turn pretty much everywhere, right? And it's not the details of that. At this moment, there are two major structural shifts, at least for the Western world, right? The one that seems to be empirically the most convincing is the generational shift, right? That the so-called cultural war, and this is the one thing the voting data is bearing out, the so-called cultural war is actually much more of an intergenerational war than anything else, right? In that sense, it has a precedent in the 1960s, which is also something of an intergenerational war. And it's the accumulation of a lot of deep cultural and social change, right? Having to do with identity and so forth, right? That congeals. And what the 2009 financial crisis adds to it, and this Professor Bardhan is right about, is the sense that whatever that way of doing things was between 1989 and 2009, right? That post-Cold War economic order, that has now run its course. Now, there's no clear articulation of what can replace it. In fact, I often think that the responses we have is simply, we did do something, now let's do the opposite. We did markets, now let's do states. Now, then we did states, now we do markets, right? So there is that general sense of a kind of cultural and political dead end, right? But it's very hard to translate that into the particular kind of currency. And that explains why actually a lot of these right-wing movements are driven by elites who are very, very secure, right? But they also have a sense that you can't continue this way, right? Working class distribution of votes, frankly, it's evenly distributed between both parties. There is no strong correlation that the white working class has totally abandoned the Democratic Party or in some senses the Republican Party. So I think that's, would it help to kind of think of, in a sense, these larger shifts? And just one more point, which is on this identity issue. I am very uncomfortable with the framing of this choice as this identity politics versus class politics. And uncomfortable with it for one particular reason, which is framing it as identity politics is itself a certain kind of trap in thinking about this, right? So you can think of two kinds of identity politics. You can think of one kind of identity politics, which is an exclusivist, separatist, enclavist policy, separate but equal, special privileges for groups. Actually, most of what is passing off as identity politics, or what right-wing critics accuse something of being as identity politics, is actually simply a demand for freedom and inclusion, right? It's actually a demand for greater individualization, in some senses, of choices. It is not. And you try this experiment, recast every claim of identity politics as a claim about freedom or inclusion, right? And in part, I think the reaction, and that's where the generational shift comes in some ways, right, is actually what Paul Mason called, the shortest definition of the fear of fascism is it's the fear of freedom, right? And you could add the fear of freedom of a certain kind of equality. That this is a kind of long, continual process, right, which we kind of go through generationally in some ways, which is the misdirection here is that we are calling it identity politics, not seeing it for the deeper cultural changes that it entails. And it's reflected in the fact that even right-wing governments have to, in the end, give some concession to it. I mean, now with seeing what has happening in Indonesia, the tide might turn. I mean, it's absolutely astonishing to believe that Indonesia can pass the kind of laws it has just passed. Right? So I think it's on this identity question, just the one kind of last question. So Professor Bardhan is right. There is a distinction between civic and ethnic nationalism, at least conceptually. I am not convinced it's helpful in explaining anything that's going on. Or that even gives a possible way out of this conundrum. So clearly a nationalism that is based in ethnic identity, that gives a majority ethnic identity a privilege, is a worse form of nationalism than one that recognizes diverse ways of being. Right? But historically, right, for particular kinds of minorities, civic nationalism and ethnic nationalism have exactly the same political consequences, because it depends on how you define the structure of civic nationalism. All civic nationalisms, when they succeeded because sociologically there was a majority in charge, right? It just didn't have to, it was so confident it didn't have to call itself the majority. That's the history of all American states. That's the history of all European nation states. And one way of thinking of the BJP's project is simply trying to do in India what Europe did in the 19th and 20th centuries, except that in our context, like in Europe, the consequences will be catastrophic. There's nothing particularly peculiar about this project, right? But civic nationalism can have the same exclusionary story in some ways, because one of the things that the BJP has done, like every other right-wing party, it has managed to fuse the liberal civic nationalism with ethnic majoritarianism. And the way it fuses it is by saying, yes, sure, civic nationalism, but then the conditions under which you are considered member of a particular society, right? They have to be exactly identical for all, even if the same constitutional value. So no common civil code, right? This one nation, one everything is actually quite compatible with the civic framing. The United States is exactly that, right? At one level, right? So one of the failures of liberal politics, and particularly in India, is for the last 70 years, we froze this debate, right? There was no civic versus ethnic nationalism. There was Congress nationalism. And Congress nationalism was based on freezing a whole bunch of questions relating to core freedom, including constitutional questions, freedom of expression, common civil code, and so forth. And the total abdication of that space. So I actually don't think the civic ethnic, and which is why civic nationalism has been as exclusionary for particular minorities, right? Because you can designate a minority an enemy of the state in many different ways. You don't have to say we're doing it just because of their ethnicity, right? You can just say they believe in a transnational political movement, end of story. That's a very civic sort of conception. Right? So anyway, sorry, just to provoke you.
Sure. Bhanu, as is usual with Pratap, he always brings out, he's so thoughtful a person. He brings out, sometimes allows otherwise shallow thinkers, make them think more. So that's a major service Pratap plays in our society, in our political society. Let me, I don't think I have full answers. Obviously, I don't have full answers to this, but let me react in some specific ways. But before I go to Pratap's comments, let me react to what Rahul brought about on in what sense democracy is declining. I think this goes to a debate, not just about theorists versus what we see, common people's views, even among theorists, even among political theorists. So, for example, I have a friend who's an important democratic theorist, Adam Zavorsky, who's often cited in political theory textbooks on democracy. He would not consider India as very much of it. I mean, I haven't talked to him recently. He would not consider India is considered very much a democracy. because he has a minimalist definition of democracy. His minimalist definition of democracy is when there are contested elections. If elections are contested, there is a chance the incumbent may be thrown out. And as long as that chance is there, that country is a democracy. Now, Adam, I have argued with Adam for long time back, not in the context of India. And by the way, I find that among Indian political scientists, Ashu Varshni takes that Adam like. By the way, this Adam Zavorsky position was also in Schumpeter's Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy book. Now, this may be my personal prejudices, but somehow I think contested elections are not enough. Well, one position is India, elections are no longer that contested, with that kind of discrepancy in funding of elections, 90% of corporate donations going to one party, contestation, the nature of contestation has changed, and also the way election commission behaves, etc., etc. But however, the contestation is probably much more important at the state level in India than in the national level. So those kind of issues, even in that context, is one should need to discuss. But and this, as I said, maybe my prejudice, I have some certain essential, between elections, what happens is important, not just as elections take place, are they contested? You see, in India, quite often, even in the case of states, when the election is really contested between BJP and other parties, once the election is over, power goes back to the Prime Minister's office. So power concentration remains. But more than that, to me, certain essential civic and cultural norms and respect for minority rights, subject to what is the definition of minority that Pratap raised, is essential. And in that sense, I would say that whatever the rhetoric, RSS never accepted the Indian Constitution. And let me put it bluntly. If you read the editorials in Organizer, around the time when the Constitution was formed, it is very much against the Indian Constitution. Now, of course, later Modi says Constitution is our holy book. Of course, a holy book that is being trampled every day. But I think theoretically, RSS never accepted it. I think, was it Golwalkar or somebody, I think later, RSS leader said, it is inconsistent with Manusmriti. It's Western. Nehru is Western, and he and Ambedkar put this on Indian, it's contrary to Indian values. This, I think, RSS generally believes in. To this day, even in 1950, that's what they believed in, and now they are implementing their belief. They never accepted the Constitution. In that sense, I would say they never accepted the idea of the usual definition of civic nationalism. And I think in that sense, some constitutional values are being changed. Populists may accept that. So in that sense, it may be a electorally sanctioned ethnic nationalism. Electorally sanctioned, but it does not, in my definition of democracy, it's not a democratic system anymore. If you just because it's electorally sanctioned. On the issue of what Rahul's talked about, in some ways, democracy is improving. Now, one sense that used to be talked about in the 1990s and in the first decade of this century was that democracy certainly was getting wider, which after independence, we had a very exclusivist democracy. Now it became wider. Large number of hitherto subordinate groups are coming up and asserting themselves, and that's something I welcome. as a welcome movement for democracy. But I think there's a distinction between widening of democracy and deepening of democracy. I think our democracy has been widened, but it has become less deep. So in that sense, I would make a distinction. Let me now come to Pratap's first point about economic security. How much does it matter, etc. Yes, I think I take many of the points that Pratap is making, but we have some evidence. We need lot more evidence on two things. One is that even the narrow definition of economic security, there are now, I have seen at least 5 or 6 statistical studies trying to correlate support for right-wing parties. I think most of the work is Europe and US, support for Trump or support for right-wing parties in individual European countries in districts or even lower with economic shocks. China shock, what in the US it's called China shock. But that's a globalization shock. But I think the data now show more than the China shock, more than the trade shock, it's more a shock due to automation. I've seen data for 11 European countries, automation in occupations which are becoming more assaulted by automation. Those occupations, right-wing support is increasing. So there are statistical studies now. So we need a lot more work, a lot more studies, and I hope we do that kind of work, empirical work in India. So even the narrow definition of economic security, we have some evidence now linking up with the rise of right-wing extremism. But the second point that I want to make, I think all this is part of a what is sometimes the sociologists call status insecurity. Namely, you are used to a certain status, or at least in your perception, you are used to a certain status. There is now a perceived decline in your status. And that can take different form. On that, the measurement wise, I think I've seen some few values surveys in which status insecurity becomes a very important issue. Namely, you had this before, you don't have any more. It's a kind of psychological loss aversion. Similarly, even in India, I would say, when some of my right-wing friends say, I don't have that many right-wing friends, but I have some of my right-wing friends who talk, openly say, you see, Muslims are getting too uppity. Now they're being put in place. He was disturbed that he was woken up in the morning by the azan and so on. They're being put in place and so on. So in a sense, we were used to a certain status, right or wrongly, we are used to certain status, we are losing that. Economically also, those of you follow the extremely important work by the economist Raj Chetty in the United States. I told Raj that Raj used to be my colleague in Berkeley, but now he's at Harvard. So Raj is doing very good work on social mobility. And social mobility, one of the results that I think I cite in the book is that if you take the 1940s cohort, and do you expect by the time you reach 30s, your inflation adjusted income, will it increase or not? And you ask that question to more recent cohort, in general, you are worse off. That kind of confidence that we'll do better, that is gone. Even though in many ways things are improving, sure. But is this perception of social mobility that was there in the United States? The United States used to be the highest mobility. One of the contributions that Raj is making is that United States, this high mobility country, actually mobility is very low. And to me, intergenerational mobility is a more important aspect of inequality. That's a dynamic inequality. Most of the Gini coefficient, etc., is static inequality. That's much more important. And I think there is something that's good. I call this problems raised by status insecurity as a kind of social vertigo. We are up there, and then we see that we may have to go down, and we look down and we get afraid. That's a vertigo, social vertigo. I actually use that expression in the book. In all this, going back to something I said in response to Rahul's earlier question, perception and reality, of course, quite often vary. Even in areas where crime is actually declining, the perception is that crime is increasing. So, and there are many reasons for that. I think we need to analyze, and the same is perception about Muslim fertility in India. They will always say, oh, they will outnumber us because fertility. I tell them, look, the fertility rate of a Muslim woman in Kerala is much lower than the fertility rate of a Hindu woman in UP. So mother's education is what is the primary determinant of the fertility rate, not religion, in statistically, if we do statistical analysis. So, but the perception goes that way. But the other points that on insecurity that Pratap made, I think I largely agree. I think a lot more. On identity policies, politics versus class politics, and a generational shift. One problem with generational shift is that I think, therefore, I'm a little hopeful about the future, that the younger people now are much more awakened about what Republicans call woke politics, etc. The younger generations. Unfortunately, to this day, in the United States, younger people don't vote. So they have all these ideas, but it does not appear in the ballot box. But I accuse the liberals and the left, certainly in the West, on this issue of confusion between identity politics and class politics, or mixing up. In fact, I find identity issues are much more important among the left in United States. And so they will often lose the support of the working classes because they're worked up about sexual orientation, which I happen to share their values. But if you make that the most important identity issue, then you're going to lose the socially conservative blue-collar workers. In fact, there is a book by that, what is it, what's his name? Mark Lilla. Yeah. He has a book where he appeals to the left. He says, look, when you think about distant peasants in India or Egypt, you are prepared to accept many of their conservative practices. But when you do evangelical Christian, you are up in arms because they're against gay rights and so on. So he said, you have to pipe down a little and don't always raise the banner of identity politics that much. That way, you're going to lose the support of many working classes, the working class voter who want minimum wages, just as the liberal parties want, but who are against gay rights or abortion rights and so on. So essentially, Mark Lilla says you have to compromise, you have to adjust and so on. On identity issue, I find the left in the United States and to some extent Europe is going too far, too fast, particularly if they want the loyalty of the working classes. On the issue of nationalism, I'm not sure I fully agree with Pratap. As I already mentioned, yes, it certainly depends on which minority. You can always redefine minorities to make even liberal constitutions exclusivist. While that is true theoretically, but I would say in many, many practical, concrete situations, the particular form of nationalism, a very narrow, poisonous form that is taking place, it is possible to make let me give you an example from Habermas, actually. So Habermas talked about constitutional patriotism. You might think it's very impractical. He gives an example from immigration policy, which is a major policy problem in Europe. Habermas says, so one of the standard right-wing arguments against immigrants, he said, against the left, is that left are all multiculturalists. So if a certain group of immigrants practice horrendous practices like female genital mutilation or other women oppressive practices, and you say, look, that's in my religion, you cannot put your hand there. Habermas says, no. You are an immigrant in Germany, and Germany has a liberal constitution with some constitutional values. Those practices are against those values. That is not acceptable. In fact, I read somewhere, and I quote that here, that the multiculturalism often in the minds of many liberals and the left means liberalism for the liberals, cannibalism for the cannibals. You cannot have that kind of multiculturalism. Otherwise, you give it as on a platter to the right wing, because they can always point out, okay, so cannibals are all right, and cannibalism is all right too. So Habermas's point is our immigration policy should be policies that are fully consistent with the constitutional values that we have. And so a woman wearing hijab is not against our constitutional values. So that's fully acceptable. But exploitation, oppression of women is not acceptable. Now, of course, oppression is an emotive term, and that can be defined differently. Similarly, this idea, one nation, one something, one nation, one leader, one language, one this, to me is fundamentally undemocratic. And this is what the extreme is China. China, through not just today, through centuries. I read a book called Tyranny of History, History of Tyranny, or something like that, on China. Essentially, throughout centuries, China had this thing of one nation, one script, one language, everything one, which is fundamentally undemocratic, because democracy to me essentially is not just tolerance, encouragement of diverse values. Diversity is an important part of it. And whenever I hear in India about whether it's Hindu, Hindustan, or one nation, one this, I get a little jolted by that. So to me, nationalism, the kind of nationalism is not just civic ethnic, kind of nationalism that insists on uniformity rather than diversity. To me, as a Democrat, to me that is suspect. And whatever it is, whether it's civic or other form, I actually talk about how civic nationalism is difficult to, is fragile, etc. In fact, in some countries, there have been cycles. Germany has gone through ethnic nationalism, and then in reaction, civic nationalism, and then ethnic nationalism, and then civic nationalism, etc. The Habermas talking about civic nationalism, but then in Germany we have AfD, which is an extreme right-wing party. But of course they are stoking latent things. AfD, which is the right-wing party, extreme right-wing party in Germany, is particularly strong in East Germany, and one of the main issues is immigration. And and this goes back to the perception issue. There are very few immigrants who go to East Germany. So there are very few immigrants there. Orban's Hungary, there are very few immigrants there. And yet the immigration is a major issue. Anyway, I don't think I've answered any of Pratap's points, but these are thoughts provoked by you.
Pratap, you want to add something to this conversation?
Just very quickly, I think two very small things. because it's something we didn't discuss enough, and I think it's important to bring out in the book. So one of the interesting points that Professor Bardhan makes is, so if you ask this question, okay, why identity politics as a locus of mobilization? And I think one of the explanations we have to think of in that context is not so much that it's a choice by the left or the choice by the right. It is that if there is de facto convergence of economic policy, and one of the things he's very good at showing is how the right completely triangulates the welfare of the left. I mean, you can have a right-wing argument for UBI, you can have a left-wing argument for UBI. And in a context of globalization, in some senses where there was a sense that national sovereignty or the national unit had less control over its economic destiny, what else would we argue over? How else would you build political coalitions when actually on pretty much the economic story, everybody has kind of converged to 2 degrees left or center. So part of the interesting question there is, in a sense, again, the structural one for social democracy, right? Which is that, is it actually a byproduct of the fact that we imagine the economy as this depoliticized space and both parties, in a sense, kind of converge to the center? So the only alternative way of differentiating yourself is, in a sense, identity and culture. But if that is the case, I mean, I think the interesting question is, what is the form of social democracy in some ways you can imagine? And this goes to your question, Rahul, as well, because I think there's a sense in which those who are claiming that democracy is deepening also, not just widening, have a point, I think, in countries like India. One, because what we are seeing is not just a product of elite manipulation. If your starting point is that, you're not only not going to diagnose, you're going to kind of come up with the wrong politics. It is a part of a much deeper articulation of lots of different suppressed histories, finding voices in very contradictory ways. And if you don't engage, in that sense, I think it is deepening. In the Indian case, it's also deepening because, frankly, state capacity has increased dramatically. I mean, what an Indian citizen now can get from the state, and I don't think it's just the state giving it as, as largesse. I mean, I actually think we are, as political scientists, as academics, I think we are way too flippant about the way in which actually incorporation through symbolism works. I mean, I'll just give you one little story on this Mr. Modi's picture on the back. So in New York, you required a vaccine certification, right, to go in restaurants in November. And this is last November. I took my vaccine certificate. The waiter looks at the certificate and says, "Whose picture is this?" So I said, "Our Prime Minister." And his first reaction was, he said, "Oh, wow, what a great idea. If you just put Trump and Biden's pictures on ours, all vaccine hesitancy will disappear." Right? So we are actually very, very bad at understanding the semiotics of, I mean, it's also a way of incorporation in some senses, that mutual identification. So in that sense, actually, the fact that a lot more people might be feeling empowered in different ways is not actually incompatible with the story that there is also deep suppression of civil liberties, deep majoritarianism, and the worry is whether even the Jaworski minimal transition will actually occur. That's what you worry about with right-wing movements. If it looks like they're going to lose an election, seriously, right? Can we now take it for granted that there will not be a temptation to engage in violence or something?
Professor Bardhan, you want to respond, and then we'll open up.
Yeah.
Okay. A lot of people have joined on Zoom. Please send your questions on Q&A chat box. My colleague Dhruv will transfer it to me. So that's why I was looking my WhatsApp, not engaging in outside world. Let me have 2 questions here, and then I'll also ask questions from Zoom. So you had a question?
Yes.
Please go. Mike, yes.
Thank you, Professor Bardhan, for the book, and thank you, CPR, for organizing this interesting discussion. Actually, I have a question like, actually, recently a think tank in Sweden has come out with a study on global democracy as a global democracy report, and which ranks countries in terms of liberal democracy index LDI. So in that report, India is ranked 93rd, and its rank is going down over the years, and it is ranked lowest among the countries in the South Asian region, just above Pakistan. So that is it's ranked just above Pakistan in the South Asian region among all the countries in the South Asian region. So actually, I want to say that I also observe that individual freedoms, cultural, social, economic freedom in India is going down. That is the perception. And so, is there a correlation between the sense of insecurity that we are feeling as an individual and lack of individual freedom that we are feeling, and how do you interpret it? So that is my question. Thank you.
Actually, my book, in the first page, I quote from that Swedish VDEM Institute. It's not so much the ranking, not ranking lower than this country, higher than that country. They actually, in the 2021 report, they call India not a democracy, but an electoral autocracy. And that, in fact, is linked to the discussion that I had with Rahul about what is a democracy. And that's what the minimal definition. I think the Swedish VDEM Institute is not using the Zavorsky type minimal definition. They are using a much more, in fact, something that I mentioned that I'm more in favor of. There's certain essential human rights component, not just the election contestation. I quote that. I also quote some other surveys, but the issue of insecurity, I go from there because different people are trying to explain this in different forms. And in fact, I didn't mention it here, but there is a book by the Indian well-known writer Pankaj Mishra called Age of Anger. He, in fact, traces the poison back to the Enlightenment. So I think Pankaj is barking up the wrong tree. But I do discuss it here. So different people have different explanations. But then my explanation, I was trying to phrase in terms of insecurities of various kinds. That's how I come to it, exactly the way you mentioned. I go from there to insecurity.
Professor Bardhan, there are three short questions from Zoom. So first one is on how do you see the idea or role of education, both in humanities and social science, to address the questions of insecurity and populism? Second one is, can you elaborate on the role of media in democracy and how media actually ignores the question of democracy? And third one, perhaps it's I'm not able to interpret this question, but I think the question is trying to ask that in United States, the politics has gone so much to the left that even politicians who are on the left or the center have to accept the far left stances in their appeal.
I don't know. I'm not sure I understand the third question. Role of education to address insecurity. Certainly, if problem with the role of, in fact, information in general is that these days it's become so polarized that your information is fake to me and my information is fake to you, and that's very easy to completely discredit the other side. But some genuine education is supposed to broaden our mind such that we accept all kinds of, listen to at least. Now you know your opponent's views, we don't even listen. Listening to others' points of view. And this has happened very much all over the world. Namely, you don't anymore pay attention to, and that's certainly social media did play a very important role there. So role of education to address insecurity, I have my doubts because of that. And of course, education, what kind of education we get very much depends on the ruling government. Different governments try to instill different values, and including in countries like India. And so whether that kind of education will address the kind of insecurity I'm talking about, I'm not so sure. Role of media actually is, again, I think it's just as by the way, I have a section on funding of elections. Similarly, who funds media is certainly very important. I was confronted with that in just the last 2-3 weeks. In October, I might as well mention it. I was asked to give an interview in NDTV, but and now since it's being hostile takeover is taking place, I have withdrawn myself from that. But on the book, there was supposed to be some conversation in NDTV. So the role of media depends on the funding. Who funds the media increasingly is being taken over by the corporate sector, and therefore, depending on the attitude of the corporate sector to democracy, it will vary. Unfortunately, much of electronic media in India now has become essentially screaming and shouting, and I don't know what does it mediate. It does not mediate anymore, so I hope media plays an important role, but in India certainly it is not playing an important role. I read the New York Times every day, but the New York Times, for example, is dismissed by large part of the right as Trump called it enemy of the people, as fake news, and a lot of people believe in that. So again, it will depend on which media do you follow, and most people do not follow any of the electronic media. But many of the media I'm thinking of, they think about the social media, and social media compartmentalized into various groups. And in fact, I quote some statistics here in my book. There is a section on role of social media. In the 2016 election, where Trump got elected, before the election, when pro-Trump false stories, this has now been checked, pro-Trump false stories were shared more than 30 million times. Pro-Hillary Clinton false stories got shared only 8 million times. So you can see, the more outrageously wrong the story is, the more it spreads, the more it's shared. And of course, the social media companies have an interest, because the more viral is something, the more advertisement revenue you get. So there is a kind of vicious circle is there. And with that kind of vicious circle, now you can see what way we're going, but there are ways of trying to at least resist it. There are attempts, including in India, fact-checking organizations. And this is where I think trade unions, again, going back to an obsolete organization. I happen to be the old-fashioned people, among the old-fashioned people who still talk about trade unions. I think trade unions have a role, because trade unions, as I said, it's not just a wage bargaining institution. They provided a role of, as I said, a worker pride. And if a trade unions come up with some unbiased, relative, quote unquote, unbiased source of information, that can be. And this brings me to something that I should have mentioned earlier in connection with nationalism. This is the right time to mention it in connection with football. Look at the football teams of Europe. There's hardly any football team of Europe where a significant part of the football team, sometimes a majority, is from a different ethnic groups. And the white working classes are taking pride. And this is, I think, an example of that the lefts and liberals can take, how you can use national pride, not go against national pride, at the same time celebrate diversity. I quote a story, not a story, it's a real thing that happened. Liverpool Football Club, the star of Liverpool Football Club is Mohamed Salah. He's from Egypt, a devout Muslim. He prays every few minutes. And one of the huge chants from the large thousands and thousands of people from the stadium mostly white working class, quite often racist otherwise. One of the chants goes like this, I quote this here. If he scores another few, I will be Muslim too. That is the chant from this large or from otherwise white working class people. So this is something tells you that you can combine national pride with tolerance for diversity.
Okay. Let me take some more questions from the room. Samriddhi, Varun, two questions.
Hi, Professor Bardhan. I had a question just relating to a very popular debate that has been taking place since yesterday. What do you see? How do you see the role of economists, especially the ones who formulate policies, participating publicly in political events? Raghuram Rajan walking the Bharat Jodo Yatra made headlines for at least hours yesterday that should academicians who formulate policies, who talk in a technocratic manner, participating in this public events and motivating other economists like you to go and walk in that yatra?
No. I want to say, Raghu is a friend. I'm all for Raghu joining whichever procession he wants to. Raghu is also a citizen. Raghu is a politically conscious being. So that has nothing to do with what technocratic advice he gives to as a central governor. And by the way, he's no longer policy in the policy determining world. This government did not listen to him on many aspects. And so he's not in the policy world. And in fact, in a sense, in front of you, I am indulging in, I'm expressing my political views, even though I have technocratic, I can give you technocratic economic advice. I think we have different hats. All of us have different roles, and they should all be allowed to play that role in whichever form, as long as they don't inspire violence in others. They should express themselves in multiple forms.
Varun?
Am I audible?
Yeah.
All right. Professor, this is a question on two fronts, basically. First, when we talk about insecurity and economic or social cultural anxieties that, you ascribe as the reason behind the rise of illiberalism, what sort of, but the policy prescriptions that you suggest sort of reorient themselves towards redistribution again. When we think about insecurity, especially economic, one would think that the answer out of that would be more growth, in the sense that people would want more economic development, and that would again bring us back to the same neoliberal paradigm, which as Pratap Bhanu Mehta sir correctly pointed out, that is what sort of landed us in this position. So then how do you sort of like draw the distinction between how to overcome that sort of economic anxiety? Is it through further growth, or is there a role that redistribution does have to play, which again would lead to the original inequality critique being validated in some sense?
I'm not one of those people who are obsessed with growth. In India is an obvious example in which we have high growth, but a lot of people did not always. Sometimes they did share, but sometimes often we do not. They did not share. But my point is more general. I'm not thinking just of the relieving these anxieties only through. Certainly not through trickle-down growth. There are some specific policies, I wouldn't call them redistributive, but insecurity relieving policies of various kinds that you can think of. And there, as I mentioned before, insecurity relief is not just relief of economic insecurity, but also kind of general cultural insecurity. And I think the leftists usually do not pay enough attention to these issues, and culture, of course, in a more general sense, cultural, socio-political anxieties. I find the leftists don't pay enough attention to those.
There was a hand at the back. Sir, want to ask? But please be brief. Yeah.
I've been asked to be very brief, sir, so I have to be brief. Lot of issues have been raised. I say issue or subject or object that we discuss all depends upon short term, whether we're talking in short term, mid term, long term, or ultimate terms. As one says, other one contradicts, other one contradicts, and we get nowhere. Now the question is, what are insecurities? Insecurity will always be there, sir.
Justice.
You cannot have word without insecurity. Now the question, what are we facing at the moment? What will be very short. I can go on and on, but I'll stop it here. What are we facing now? The main issue that world is facing, all is reality. You talk about Germany, I can talk about Germany to the end. Germany don't want to have the babies, they want to have the labor from abroad, and then they're worried what to do now. One question. Now the question is, my question is, sir, the world is going to remain insecure, but what we're facing at the moment, that is, this is going to be short term and the medium term. I don't know about the long term, short term, medium. But the problem that world is facing is sectarianism versus liberalism and radicalism. These are two forces. They're interplaying with the game. I can prove every historic. I'm a student comparative studies and evolution of history. I can prove every event in the world which has its genesis in the sectarianism and radicalism.
Thank you. Thank you again, Professor Bardhan. What a treat and pleasure this was to listen to you, and also Pratap Mehta. Thank you everyone for coming out today and asking such wonderful questions. CPR President Yamini has sent her apologies. She has been caught in administrative duties. So thank you again, everyone, for coming out. And thank you, Pratap and Professor Bardhan.
Thank you.